Good afternoon, church family. It's Wednesday, and so it's time for another Wednesday Minister Moment. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus gives us the Sermon on the Mount, or he begins the Sermon on the Mount. And this is a sermon about how the followers of Jesus should live. But he begins this sermon with blessings. And the very first blessing that he mentions is this: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, the word for poor here is a word that means reduced to begging. It means that you realize that you are powerless. And this phrase, poor in spirit, is connected to another phrase in a proverb in the Old Testament. In Proverbs chapter 16, verse 19, it says this: "Better to be lowly in spirit and among the oppressed than to share plunder with the proud." The writer here makes this comparison between the two. And he says, those who are plundering others, gaining wealth from others, and who are proud of that, it's really better to be those who are in the other category, who are oppressed and who are lowly in spirit. And Jesus seems to agree with this because in the Sermon on the Mount, these people, many of these people, were also people that were oppressed. Now, what is poor in spirit? I mean, what does that look like? Well, maybe one of the best examples of it is found in a parable in Luke chapter 18. There's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Now, a Pharisee is a teacher, one who is a religious teacher who is looked upon with respect by other people. But a tax collector is somebody who's really an outcast. He's considered to be somebody who's siding with the Romans because he works for the Roman government. By the religious leaders, he's considered to be unclean. You don't want to hang out with him. Just stay away from him. And so both of these men go up to the temple to pray. And it says this: "The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over there. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all that I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and he said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And Jesus then says this: "I tell you that this man," and he's referring to the tax collector, "that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." You see, it's the tax collector who is accepted by Jesus. He knew that he needed God. But the Pharisee, he was so proud of what he had done, it was almost as though he really didn't need God at all. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. Basically, there's a physical ailment that he has of some kind. We don't know exactly what it is. And he prays to God that God takes it away from him, but he doesn't take it away from him. In fact, the answer he gets is in verse 9. He said, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And so Paul's response to that is this. He says, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." What Paul came to realize is that when he needed God, when he realized he had to depend upon God, that's when he became strongest, because he relied on Christ's strength rather than his own. There's a minister in the Dallas area that phrases it in this way. He says, and his name is Jonathan Pokluda, and he phrases it in this way. He says, "When dependence upon God is the goal, weakness is my advantage." Now let me say that again. When dependence upon God is the goal, weakness is my advantage. So we look at our weaknesses and we consider them to be things we don't want to have, and yet maybe what they are truly our strengths, because then we rely on the strength that Jesus gives us. I want to ask you a few questions. Have you realized that you just aren't good enough? That you make mistakes? And in that realization, then you know that you really need God. You really need His grace. You really need His mercy. You really need His love. Do you pray to God? But then sometimes those prayers don't seem to go anywhere, and you wonder whether God's really listening. And yet, even though you have difficulty praying, you still continue to pray because you know that you need God? Are there times that you have doubts, that you have struggles that you face? And even in those doubts and those struggles, you continue to come back to God. You continue to seek Him, even with those doubts, because you know how much you need Him in spite of the doubts that you have, in spite of the struggles. If you do those things, you may be poor in spirit, and you need to know that in God's eyes you're blessed. The reality is this, that when you continue to rely on the strength that God gives you, even when you're weak, because you know the need that you have for God, that is what poor in spirit is. So may you be blessed as you realize your great need for God. And may you also realize that the kingdom of heaven is for you. I hope these words are an encouragement to you, and I hope that you will have a blessed day.